welcome back, everyone. I hope you had enough time to get at least a little bit of lunch. We're going to change the format a little bit from this morning and not have the talks happen at the podium. We thought it'd be more informal just to have everyone sitting here right from the start. So that's point one. And point two, I'm not going to do the formal introduction of what's on the paper because you can just read it, but I want to say a couple of things about each of our panelists today. And first of all, I guess I should say my name is Mark Giordano, and I'm a professor in the School of Foreign Service, involved with our program in science, technology, and international affairs, and then also working on the India Initiative. So our two panelists today are Griff Thompson, who is current job is Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation at the Department of State, and Richie Ahuja, who is the Asia Director for the Environmental Defense Fund. Both of them have been very gracious with their time in working with the India Initiative, and in particular, a class that we're run as an experiment to go for a year working on a particular problem in India and then bringing the students to India to talk about the results that they've come up with Indian policymakers. And both of them have graciously donated their time to coming to the class. So that's one thing I wanted to say about them and to thank them for it. And then the other thing is to say a small interconnection between all of us. I'm from Eastern Washington. Turns out that Griff is also from Eastern Washington, and Richie is about to move there in 20 days. Not to Eastern Washington, but to Washington State. So it's probably, I guess we're the only three people from Washington in the room. The other Washington in the room, and we're all sitting on the stage now. So first, let me turn it over to our panelists to say some opening comments, and then we'll go to some questions from the audience and from myself. Griff.
Thank you, Mark. Well, first of all, again, I want to thank Irfan, Mark, and the program for inviting the State Department and me to come and talk to you today. I've been working in India on and off for the last 20 years, both from an NGO when I ran the energy office at USAID, and now working on both climate and renewable energy efficiency. And I think the topic of today's panel is prime for India. I think India is doing some fabulous, innovative things, and I want to talk a little bit more about what I mean by innovative and where I think the innovation is most needed. But I think Prime Minister Modi's goal of 175 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2022 is phenomenal. And we got involved with India most recently after a meeting between President Obama and Prime Minister Modi after the Prime Minister had established that goal, and both parties realized that in order to achieve that goal, there needed to be some fundamental changes on institutions. And so we established a U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force managed by my department, my bureau, and we've been working for 2 years with government officials in India, with the private sector, and most recently we have created another program funded out of my office that Rick Rousseau will talk about in the next panel on looking at the subnational, looking at state to state, city to city relationships, because much of what India is trying to do in their country mirrors how we are organized and how we function on the electricity sector here in the United States. So I look very much to listen to Rishi and talking to all of you and receiving questions in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Rishi?
Thanks, Mark, and likewise, thank you so much for having me here on the panel, and very happy to volunteer the time. It's actually been a real joy participating with the students and talking to them about their projects. Just again, as a quick background, one, I work with the Environmental Defense Fund, look after our operations in India. And one of the things that I really want to set right as we talk about energy here is, so EDF's gone into India, one of the main focus points is to think about climate change. And energy certainly fares well in that, and it's a big piece of the equation. But really, the hat that I always keep trying to wear, and I'm from India, is we're trying to solve the development problem, not the energy problem. And the question to ask is, how do we solve the development problem, and what's the role of energy in that? So that's kind of where we come in. And then how do we do so? And the third layer then comes up on top as EDF is, how do we do so in a way that also addresses climate change? So that's 3 layers that I'm already working with. And the development problem in a nutshell, when we think about it, is, it's India's national interest. It's jobs, it's water, it's sanitation, the stuff that previous panelists talked about. it's mobility, and a whole bunch of things. So that's the kind of hat we're trying to wear and figure this out, and be happy to talk about it more as we move forward.
Okay, great, thank you. So Griff, let me ask you the first question. You said one of the big issues is innovation. Yeah. What kind of innovation is needed in energy in India?
Well, thank you, Mark. And that is, I think, the key question. And what I want to do is, first of all, disabuse folks of the assumption that innovation is required in the technology. I quickly go into a high wattage rant when I keep hearing folks talk about we need more energy innovation, we need new technologies, and when we have folks like Bill Gates, we need an energy miracle. We don't need an energy miracle on technology. Technology, R&D, absolutely essential, especially the holy grail in terms of storage. But we have commercially ready technologies now in India, in the United States, in Africa, around the world. The dramatic cost of renewable energy is phenomenal. NTPC prices over the last 15 months have dropped 33%. So what's needed in innovation, the kind of innovation we need, is policy innovation, finance model innovation, business model innovation. And that's where India is doing it right. Their UDAY scheme is working at the right thing. How do you transform the institutions, the DISCOMs, to make them financially viable? Again, the machines work. We in the West, and this has been the story since the Enlightenment, we have almost a pathological passion for the machine. If you have a problem, we'll create a new gadget, a new widget, a new technical artifact. We continually substitute technical solutions for what are in reality political problems. And so it's because it's much harder, and people are entranced with the gold and the glitter and the shine of the new machine, but it's tough to roll up your sleeves and transform the habits of institutions, the habits of policy, and that's what's necessary. And what we're doing with India is looking at what are the new financial instruments, and what do you have to do to change the policies and regulatory structures that will accommodate the type of finance that is out there and waiting and wanting to invest in India, but because of the lack of security of contract or whatnot, the money is waiting. So again, and getting to Richie's point, Richie is exactly right. And this is the other fallacy that continues to be promulgated, and what I do in my classes here at Georgetown to disabuse. Again, energy is not the end, it's development. Renewable energy service provision is the antecedent condition for the realization of everything on the development agenda. And why we at the State Department are involved in energy is because many times it's the precondition and involves much of what we're trying to do in our foreign policy. So again, energy is the means, development's the end. Prosperity, good health, et cetera, et cetera. So as Aristotle keeps telling us, we can talk about Aristotle in a Catholic university. You have to understand what your telos is. What is your end? What is the final cause? As Richie quite rightly says, the final cause, the telos, is development. The material cause is renewable energy technologies for that low carbon, diverse portfolio of electricity service.
Thanks. Richie, do you want to follow up?
Actually, sure. So again, I mean, just actually coming back to your first point when you mentioned something about subnational, that seems to be a big place for us as well to try and figure out how to deploy at some scale and get the institutions right. So I actually want to use that point, what you just talked about, and offer an example of what that kind of, how we're thinking about some of these things. So if you think of Indian landscape, so the rural India, we talked about urbanization, et cetera, but really in the aggregate, rural India is growing. It's not shrinking. So there's 169 million rural households. They're going to grow to about 179 million, while in India, in total, sum total population grows, and so does the urban center, the population. So it's going to be the most urban and the most rural nation at the same time. And when you start thinking about rural India, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to go with it. It has to be about, Senator Mark Warner said, I mean, how do we make capitalism work for everybody? Prime Minister Modi is talking about getting the jobs right, making India keep things local. And then there's this issue of waste. Drinking water is a major problem. There's arsenic in the Indo-Gangetic belt, fluoride problems in Karnataka and Andhra. You're trying to solve so much, not enough refrigeration for value addition for farming services. So we sort of started toying around with these ideas, and then when you look at the energy infrastructure, it's about cost recovery often, the transmission distribution losses are high, and there's not real strong incentive to pay for the energy in the rural India. So we sort of said, hey, can we think about a way to innovate out of it or do something different? So we're actually building the first mini grid in India at the moment of its kind. It's a 1 megawatt with arrangements with the government, which actually is a concentrated solar thermal. We're delivering electrons with priority to the local community, but the community is an equity stakeholder in that. So the villagers will earn income. There's a lot of transparency, so there's incentive to pay. Also, we capture 95% of the steam and convert it into 60,000 liters of drinking water a day. And we capture the waste heat to run 2,000 cubic centimeters of storage, refrigerated storage. And so that's one piece. And then we started thinking about the other things about wastage, et cetera. So we're trying to think about how do we integrate peri-urban waste now and use plasma incinerators, et cetera, to create energy. So again, solving the development problem, it creates a lot of jobs. We're going to measure how many jobs that are created, but it creates a room for other kinds of investors. So we talk about energy investors, but here now you can start talking about stacking investments. So you talk about energy investor, water investor, waste investor, refrigeration. So it changes the equation a fair bit. So just as an idea.
Thank you. Griff, you're coming at this from the State Department point of view. So can you, whether you're talking about institutional innovation or whatever, or technological innovation, for what is needed, the innovation that's needed in India now, does India require help from outside? Can India do it by itself? Or does India have something to teach the US?
Yes. All three, I think.
Right.
One, India can do it by themselves to a certain extent. I mean, I don't need to tell anyone in this room the brilliance from the social sciences to the hard science that resides in that wonderful country. But what we do at the State Department is receive requests from country after country after country who have started to realize or have accepted the fact that they need to diversify their energy portfolio for economic prosperity, domestic and regional security, and for, yes, better health, better air. And they know that, and when you introduce a new technology, it's the reason they're called disruptive technologies. They disrupt the status quo, they disrupt the vested economic interests, and they disrupt the vested political interests. And it becomes very political very quickly. And so what countries come to us, and this is what India and the US is doing, is tell us what you guys did. How did the United States transform your domestic market to include renewable energy, PV, concentrated solar, wind, et cetera, et cetera? We don't want to waste our time trying to create models that don't work. Tell us what works, and we will adapt it to the exigencies of the Indian economy. So what we do is sit down with them and say, listen, this is what we do. We have 50 states in the United States. We have, as Justice Brandeis famously said, 50 laboratories of democracy. In fact, there are 50 laboratories of experimentation. So when we sit down with our task force, we bring the best and the brightest from the federal level, we bring the best and the brightest from the public sector, and share lessons with any country. With India, we sit down and we learn as much from them as they learn from us. They are doing a wonderful job in terms of acknowledging, yes, you need the institutional scaffolding to accelerate the flow of private capital into the energy sector. One of the things that we at the State Department, at least me and my office, and I normally get just blank stares when I say this, but this is a more enlightened crowd, so I think I can, it'll work here. My contention is that we within the energy community have been far too exclusive, and this builds on Richie's points. We continue to only talk to other energy people. In fact, if you view the causal arrows properly, energy is the means to everything else. So the health ministry, the education ministry, the land ministry, the water ministry, the industry ministry, they are all dependent upon the success of the energy ministry. But most, or not most, but a number of significant policy changes that need to be made that will accelerate the adoption of renewable energy and energy efficiency lie outside the purview of the energy ministry. And so we in the diplomatic corps, I think, have underestimated and underplayed the catalytic role and the diplomatic power of energy service provision. I maintain that electrons can be as important as elections in building democratic culture and good governance regimes. Because getting people together, and this is why I'm so intrigued by Richie's mini-grid in the Panchayat, getting people together to do what is the fundamentals of politics, that is who gets what, where, how, and why, around the core of energy service provision will allow those individuals to exercise their political muscles, their democratic muscles. Again, as Aristotle said, ethics and politics is a practical science, not a speculative science. We become political men and women, we become ethical men and women by doing ethical things, practical things, and getting people together in a community to decide how they are to obtain their energy services is about as democratic as you can get. And once you form those muscles, guess what? You're going to want to exercise those muscles in other areas. And so what India is doing in the vast amount of experimentation that they're performing will be a beacon to every other country around the world, developed or developing, because we're all going to be looking to India and to share experiences and share lessons learned.
So Richie, I'll ask you one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions. So following the same line of thinking about the interconnections between sectors and how you have to work across sectors, and you said your interest is in development, not energy per se. Now, it's one thing if you can sit at a local level and talk about what is wanted locally. What do you have to do if you're trying to make a difference in the energy sector at a higher level with government? How do you get other ministries involved? What's your tactic, or what are your reflections on what works and what doesn't work to get people talking across the sectors that they have direct responsibility for?
Oh, loaded question. So look, we are trying to work on the nexus of land use and energy. And we're trying, again, the idea for us had been to build sandboxes. So often we've heard about many times here as well. So India is a nation on the move. There's change happening, and the country is changing in front of our eyes, and it's going to continue to do so with urbanization, infrastructure development, et cetera. So everybody's in a hurry. But one of the things that really helps is to create, and India is also hungry for transparency and accountability models. The government actually wants those. And if you can build those and demonstrate benefits directly in large enough sandboxes, so India is also not homogeneous, so you have to really try and think about subnational level plays, a large scale plays, and large scales in India means 500,000, 1 million households across multiple states, to learn for ourselves first and then go with that model to the government and say, hey, now we want larger sandboxes, and can you give me a district? And this is what it's going to take in terms of budget reorientation. So then finding the right spokesperson in the government's been the main thing. So for us, we've been using the best of technology and trying to sort of measure transparency and accountability, but really getting the right convener in and getting all the ministries together is a challenge. So we just got the government to agree to deploy clean cooking through our model across a district last month and reorient about $50 million to try and do this at some scale to, again, learn, not just to say this is going to be our policy. So Ministry of Finance plays an important role. Ministry of Energy is a major actor in this space. Ministry of Oil and Gas. But really, the main thrust of our conversation has been this is going to create these many jobs. It's going to save the country this much, $1 billion in forex if we do this. It creates income potentially from carbon mitigation, from local markets, national markets, leads to your INDC goals. So again, park it all in the national interest. You will get the attention.
Great. Any questions from the audience? Yes.
So you were talking about better water, air, everything. But so I have a quick question. Like I know, India being such a complex country, just wondering that, especially after Modi came into power, there has been a lot of empowering of the people, where people have taken it upon their own hands to do a lot of things. Like they're not waiting for the government. They are probably going and cleaning lakes, and they are, taking stormwater, prevention measures. And, there's so much going on, and people are ready to do something to change. There's more and more citizen involvement. So I'm just thinking, like, rather than a top-down approach of it's a great thing of, how you are distributing the, the cooking stoves or something that you said right now. Rather than, I'm just thinking if we can talk about some bottom-up measures so that things can implement quickly and change can happen a little bit more.
So can I answer
Yes.
that? So really, this has been bottom-up. So one, I think the testing has been bottom-up, but in the end, to put it very simply, if you want to build a school, so if you want to make a government understand the value of education, let's just say hypothetically, you can build some schools and really demonstrate value at some scale, right? But if you want to build school and within walking distance of every child in India, the government has to be an important actor in that. So our job has been to demonstrate the value of what we are trying to do, bottom up and bottom up participation, and then provide those models to the government and say, here's a way to think about this. And with regards to, I really like what you just said, but I think there's a cause and effect issue also, because in terms of people really becoming active, India is a young country. In the last 10 years, a number of young people sort of stepping up and stepping forward, I think they are hungry. I mean, we're moving very rapidly. Culture is changing. We're moving very rapidly beyond the culture politics or caste politics to really, people are hungry for change. And the youth involvement is as much to a catalyst as perhaps the political. So just that the young nation is sort of trying to make a change and take control to some degree. And I see that in the cities a lot, in the villages where we travel. People are hungry. They ask me questions. People in villages in India are asking me, how do I get to the United States? Or should I study English? Or should I study BCom? It's fascinating.
Can I build on that question that you just asked? I think admittedly there is a symbiotic relationship between behavior of the population and some of the architecture and infrastructural changes that you bring about by planning or through government intervention. There are very entrenched cultural beliefs, religious beliefs, superstitions, which often come in the way of implementation of some of the best laid plans.
Right.
Talk about Swachh Bharat and toilet building, for example, is a classic example of where there is a dichotomy between what the population is tuned to do for hundreds of years and what you're trying to impose. What kinds of change management efforts have been made at the grassroots level to make sure that the mindset shift that is so important and imperative to bring about some of these changes is being executed effectively?
Do you want to take it?
I mean, that's a brilliant question, and it feeds off to the opening question of innovation. And again, when we started on rural electrification programs 30, 40 years ago, again, we were captured by the engineering community, who were enraptured with the elegance of the engineered machine, and wondered why the people in the village didn't adopt every machine that we suggested to them. Because they failed to understand the anthropological, as you said, it's the socio-cultural dimension, it's the behavioral habits that form, that base individuals' decisions to act or not to act. And it's called the Veblennian dichotomy, Thirst and Veblen. It's the instrumental behavior versus ceremonial behavior. And ultimately, when you're trying to diffuse technologies, oftentimes it's the ceremonial behavior that will simply refuse to accept the instrumental utility of a technology. So what you need to do, and again, it builds off the former question, is you need to work with the community. We work with the Rural Cooperative Association, both in the US and overseas, and they do a tremendous amount of time going into a community and educating them, informing them, oh, yeah, and let's listen to them. Let's see what their needs are. Let's see what they want. And once we start communicating and translating what the outcome of the technologies are to meet their demands, things seem to work better. Again, people don't care about energy. People care about energy services. I want a cold beer, a hot meal, instant access to the internet, an air-conditioned room, etc. I don't know kilowatts from gigawatts, BTUs from joules. But I know a cold beer when I have one.
Right.
And so, and communicating that, what are the energy services that you need in this community? And let's figure out how to get it. And I think by doing that within a communal setting, you not only provide the electrons, but you can perform the sorts of things that we continue to default to elections in terms of bringing people together to understand cooperation, collaboration, and conflict resolution.
So, not yet. I mean, it's beginning to. So you're seeing the glimmers. So from our point of view, also, I just want to add, I mean, that was so eloquently put. I mean, like, from our point of view, just basically it's, I'm from India, I'm from Varanasi. I grew up in Bihar. It doesn't get more, and I've been to every state and, grew up as a banker's son in the country. And I tell you, I've been wrong so often working in the country, right? So one of the things that we've learned very rapidly is that you can, one is the value of communicating or communicating very clearly the value that you're bringing to the table, to the community, is really important. And once they internalize that value, then throw stuff back at you, you have to really listen. And then second, you define the principles under which that particular action is going to take place and the outcomes you want, and let the community self-organize. You don't have to force, and often based on those principles, they often organize on similar lines. And that's what we learned working in different states. So that was a huge lesson. And I think you're spot on. It's going to take work, but it needs to be done.
Shireen?
So building off of that, my question is, from where you are positioned, if it is so critical to engage with communities and position new energies within a frame that makes sense across different places, of India, which level of government do you interact most with? Is it the subnational or the national? And the second part of my question is, in your experience, is there alignment there on the issues of energy, right? Because as I grew up in India too, I see the state government and the national government alignment as being so, look at big successes like Green Revolution. They came from alignment there, and big things were possible. We doubled food output in a year, right? So I'm just curious about your experience of that on issues of energy.
Sure. If I didn't know better, I would have thought this is a salted question, because it's such a wonderful question, and it really gets to the sweet spot of what we're doing in the Energy Bureau, because you're exactly right, Shireen. It's all about alignment. And getting back to the question in terms of how do you interest the other sectors within any level of government, it is you have to speak, again, it's whether you're speaking to a villager or a bureaucrat, you have to speak in their language, and you have to identify what their goals, motivations, and ends are. We have to get them to understand what Tocqueville all exhorted us to, is to understand your self-interest rightly. It's the self-interest of all the bureaucracies, all the bureaucrats there, to start understanding, how does energy affect me? So when we're speaking about alignment, and we hear this from mayors, we hear it from governors in the United States and the federal level, you need horizontal policy alignment and you need vertical policy alignment. We continue to live in a Westphalian world state. It's the nation states that have primary sovereignty, and the State Department works nation state to nation state. But over the last number of years, we have understood one of the two global trends that are really dominating international relations, and that's the decentralization and devolution of economic and political power to subnational elements. So we have ramped up what the term of art is paradiplomacy, working our foreign policy through subnational levels. Many of the states in the United States have their own foreign policy departments. They do as much travel as the State Department do. And whether it's for economic good or commerce and trade, whatever. And so this is why we launched this partnership in partnership with CSIS that Rick will talk about in the afternoon session. Well, we will continue to work in the U.S.-India Clean Energy Finance Task Force, which is essentially at the federal level. We understood the need to work at the state and the city level. And the Indian federal system of government parallels what the United States is, where we decentralize much of the authority for electricity to our states and locals. I finally had an epiphany after about 20 years ago talking to a leader in Tamil Nadu. And after about 45 minutes of polite conversation, wonderful tea and biscuits, he said, well, thank you very much, Dr. Thompson, for coming here. It's nice to have a U.S. diplomat here, but frankly, next time, can you bring a mayor or a city planner? Because they really will understand my needs. And so I apologize profusely for taking up his time, but thanked him wonderfully for enlightening me and said, yeah, you're absolutely right. I've got nothing to offer you. And so what we do have to offer at the State Department level is a forum, a platform. And so we find that states and cities and utilities and companies and universities love to work with the State Department under the imprimatur of the Secretary of State in a bilateral relationship where we can open doors and provide the visibility of them doing the work. So what we try to do is create this platform and then get the hell out of the way and let the real experts talk to one another.
There's a question back here.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for this articulate discussion. I'm Parag Nathani, and my question stems from the idea that India is not unique in terms of infrastructure deficient countries that tend to have high cost of capital, and which impedes innovation, and that then you need more infrastructure to lower the cost of capital, and that forms a vicious circle if you cannot do it. So I'd just like to hear from you, what do you see as the role of your organizations in fostering an environment that helps reduce cost of capital and then foster innovation and take it, scale it up, not just at the pilot level, but also kind of induce that change at an institutional level?
I think you're doing more on that end, so you should.
Yeah, I mean, I'd happy to. Thanks for sharing. I'd reverse the causal arrows. From my perspective, it's innovation that'll reduce the cost of capital. It's innovation in policy and finance models. And so what we are doing in the task force is saying, listen, there's a lot of capital out there. But you're exactly right. The cost of capital for some of these energy projects are far too high. So what we engage in is risk mitigation. How can the public sector engage in risk mitigation instruments and policies and regulations? A very good friend of mine who runs environmental finance for one of the world's biggest international banks keeps telling me, he says, Griff, fix the institutions and the money will find them. It's that simple. Saying it is simple, changing the institutions is difficult. But for example, the three things that we're looking at specifically in India is one, standardization of the power purchase agreement. We listen to energy developer after energy developer, and they keep saying the diversity, the multiplicity of different types of PPAs raises the cost of capital. So we're working with them and IRETA and MNRE and the Power Ministry done wonderful work on revising and standardizing their power purchase agreements. But there's also standardization of attendant documents as well. So you need to standardize and, again, lower the risk, which raises the capital for these energy projects. The other one is, what we're doing in the task force, is a payment security mechanism. Again, the discoms are frail fiscally. But they are working through the new program to shift that risk to the state governments, which will lower the cost of capital. But nevertheless, there needs to be, oftentimes the project developers are paid 6 months, 9 months in arrears. Again, it raises the cost of capital. So how do you do that? How do you provide a security mechanism that'll kick in to pay the developer without also raising moral hazard? So we've got experts in India and the United States working to figure out what would a payment security mechanism be. And then we're looking at securitization of solar assets. How can you securitize these solar assets and then float bonds to raise funding for finance? So again, our perspective in this task force is innovation. Innovation of policy models, finance models, and business models will lead to lower cost of capital.
Just add to that. So there's two little points on this. It's not just leading to lower cost of capital, but also reducing transaction costs in a big way that allows things to happen at the same cost of capital, perhaps. That's okay too. So that's just something to keep in mind, because that's what we one of the big learnings we had, some scalable work that we did on farming systems and service delivery to farmers through sort of integrating their value chain. And on the other point, just the previous question about developing platforms, I think if you want to socialize an idea, and I think India would do well given how diverse it is and it's sort of culturally embedded in different states, to actually create a peer-to-peer learning platforms. So let more conversations happen amongst district magistrates, between states, between policy actors at different levels, to really deploy the best practices. I think that doesn't happen enough in India. So creating those sandboxes and getting those champions to really do a peer-to-peer transaction or conversation is really important. So that's something we found at the NGO level when we try to create something scalable, to create that peer-to-peer learning platform. Because once you create it, you sort of create a race to the top. Because then they want to learn from each other and replicate instead of us going in and saying, please do this. Because really, I'm not the best communicator of doing whatever that this is.
Well, that's essential. I'm a big fan of peer-to-peer. People love to talk about what they know and love to listen to others who know what they're talking about. Right. And again, it's like the states. They don't want to talk to somebody that doesn't understand what they're doing. But you get 2 engineers, 2 power utility managers in a room, and my God, if you don't know the language, you're going to be bored to death. But because they are so passionate it'll just take off.
Right.
Okay, I think the final question.
Given the role of India becoming a quite apparent emerging economy over the last few decades, how do you think the role of the G20 in regard to setting a framework that India and the UN could agree on in terms of green financing for certain endeavors that India may have, but the US may disagree on? And how do you think that framework, like the Sustainable Development Goals that was set by the UN in 2015 and other agreements aligning with economic, environmental, and social aspects of states in the world, how do you think that India could benefit from that, where the US may find certain points that they disagree on?
I didn't fully quite get the question. Can you help me?
Sorry?
Can you summarize that again briefly? I couldn't keep track of the full question. I'm sorry. So
So
you're asking about the SDGs
and the role of the G20 in setting
Okay.
certain parameters.
And green
Okay.
financing. was
and green
the first one.
financing. So from my point of view, look, the country signed on to SDGs not because it had to or anything. It signed on to SDGs because it's on a national interest is being served. It is an important indicator. There's a desire to lift the HDI up in a significant way. And within India, there's a lot of, if you look at a competitiveness index or a study of the various states, there's a lot of disparity as well. So I think this is a good lever to sort of get the country to really start thinking about how do we change everything. So that's good. I don't think that's a win-lose situation. It's something that the country wants to do. With green financing, I am of the opinion often that financing is enough. I mean, you need good projects, you need good institutions, you need good models. Financing is there, and there's, as long as you get reasonable returns, it happens. I think green finance, I think of it more as a catalytic finance or a first risk guarantee or something on those lines. I don't see green finance as going into developing huge infrastructure projects, et cetera, on those lines.
Griff, any follow-up?
No, I agree with Richie. I sometimes, the qualifier of green to financing somehow marginalizes it or suggests that it is of lesser quality or a lower rate of return, and that's quickly becoming a misnomer. And so let's just talk about financing. And so you're financing some green projects. In fact, green is going to be, it's been proven a long time, you can go green without going in the red.
Right.
And green is very profitable. And so I think we tend to marginalize the magnitude of change that is occurring by qualifying it. In terms of the G20 and India, I'm going to have to pass on that one because our G20 discussions are still evolving. And I'd like to keep my job.
Okay.
So hey, just on the green finance, can I add one more piece? Is that, look, I think as we learn more, so this is a good example of what I learned through my team at EDF was, greener buildings actually have lower insurance rates, have longer value. People want to come in and live there. Once you sort of get that, then really raising finance to that is much easier than raising finance for a non-green building in the long run, if you sort of extrapolate. So that's where I sort of say, if you can get the catalytic finance and show the value, and the rest of the finance should follow.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about in terms of what innovation really means, where cooperation needs to happen and where interchange can happen, both up and down scales as well as across sectors, and thoughts on financing and how everyone can make a contribution. So I'd like to thank you both again, Griff and Richie, for being here, and end this session. And there's now a coffee break that's very short, as I understand it. Very short, I'm told. And then we'll meet back in here. So thank you very much.
Thank you, folks.